Anin Bojo, I'm Sherry Lawson, the host of Indigenous Voices, We're Still Here. Today, my special guest is Matthew Douglas. He's an Indigenous engineer, Aboriginal, Native, First Nations. Probably sometime in the next few weeks, we'll talk about those titles, but he is an engineer by trade. Welcome, Matthew.
Thank you for having me.
Can you just introduce yourself in whatever way you think you want to for our folks at home?
Sure. Anin Bojo, Matt Douglas, Nadijnakas, Menjikining Donjaba, Mong Dodum. So that means my name is Matt. I'm from Rama, or Menjikining as we call it in the language. I'm of the Loon clan. And as Sherry alluded to, I'm a professional engineer. I'm a civil engineer by trade. And I'm here to answer some questions.
Okay. Tell us about your education, where you went to school, and where you've worked since you graduated too.
Okay. I went to Carleton University in Ottawa and did my Bachelor's of Engineering there. And after that, I started out as a structural engineer in Ottawa and decided that's not for me. Moved out west to BC, became a consulting engineer out there, predominantly doing environmental work and civil work. So civil being infrastructure construction, working with a lot of remote First Nations along BC. And then from there, I went and joined the federal government, which was INAC then, Indigenous Northern Affairs Canada, and is now ISC, Indigenous Services Canada, as a senior engineer. And now I moved to the Atlantic region and doing the same role. And now I'm back in Ontario working as a project manager, primarily for First Nations. I work with a firm called FHR Inc.
Okay, thank you. So you've worked basically from sea to sea in Canada, basically working mostly for Indian country. Am I right?
Mostly, yeah. I've predominantly First Nations.
Okay, so I think people will be surprised to know that, as we used to call it, the Department of Indian Affairs has engineers working for them. Why do they have such a department?
Yeah, it's funny you mention it because they have a different view than I would have, I think. Because I thought, as the role of a senior engineer working for ISC was to provide technical advice and guidance to First Nations. But since coming to the Ontario region, some people have that view and some people have it as a save money view, which can be problematic.
Because they're working for the federal government.
Exactly.
Okay, so we'll talk in a few minutes about some of the challenges involved. But so when you were traveling or dealing with remote communities, what did that look like? What does that really mean? And how did they find you, or how did you find them?
Well, I guess predominantly when I was a consultant, we were working with ISC then. ISC is how I'll refer to the federal government. Predominantly closing landfills in remote First Nations and setting up transfer stations so they could start managing their waste in a more responsible manner. And I use the term responsible loosely. I don't mean they're being irresponsible, but a lot of times First Nations have a finite land base and you don't necessarily want to take up your land base with a landfill if there's one, not that far away that you could send it to that has all the proper engineering controls in place.
So in a lot of these First Nations communities across Canada, doesn't matter what province you're in, there's a lot of infrastructure problems, which means roads, bridges. How do you get from one place to the other? Yeah. Is the soil stable enough to put a big building up on? And the other thing you've just mentioned is that what we used to call the dump, there's problems with those as well, too, because for a long time, they've just been dumping over there. Am I right?
Yeah, or just burning it or doing whatever they want with it. Whatever they were forced to do because they didn't have any other solutions.
Okay. So let's say that there's a remote First Nations community in north of Vancouver. Would Indian Affairs, or whatever you're calling them, ISK, I'll always call them Indian Affairs, I'm of the right age, would they say, okay, we need to go over to such and such a place and work on such and such? Or how would that relationship come about?
Well, in the BC region, which is where I was doing that work, they had a really good engineer who was working for ISK who actually cared about the communities, and he would kind of go in and he built up a team of which we were part of it. There was some other like community planner type people who would go into communities and see what their needs are, work with them to figure out what kind of solutions would work for them before we even got involved as a consultant. So they were actively looking for First Nations to help, which is kind of a change, because if you hear of a lot of the water problems, it's very much a reactive issue rather than a proactive issue. We can get into that a little bit more if you like.
Okay, so if you're going into this community to do work because you've just hired people, then you have discovered they need such and such. So the engineers come in and say, okay, we're going to move the dump over to here. We have to put up a fence. We have to find out where the groundwater is, all that kind of thing. Am I right?
Yeah. But we're not, I do want to state that we never told communities what they need to do. We worked with communities to figure out solutions that would work for them and help implement.
Okay. Okay.
Because
so
what you're talking about is the ISK paternalistic approach, which does still happen occasionally.
Okay. And you never know when you might have to go back to work for them. So you have to be nice. I, however, don't.
I don't think I have to be nice. I think that ship has sailed for me.
Okay, so you've mentioned water. Canadians, Ontarians, Simcoe Countyans know about some of the problems with water in First Nations communities. Tell us a little bit about that from your perspective.
Well, a lot of people would be surprised to know that there's a community not that far outside of Toronto who's on a long-term boil water advisory. And you probably know who they are. I'm not going to mention them by name, but there's a few communities not that far outside of Toronto. We're not talking remote communities that have been on long-term boil water advisories. And this is going on all across country. There's one, Semiahmoo, they're right outside of White Rock, which is a big city right outside of Vancouver, and they're on a boil water advisory. They're in the middle of a city, and they're on a boil water advisory. So these issues are happening all over the province. It's not just in remote northern communities, although they are happening there as well.
So tell us, for all the people who just turn on the tap and drink their water and always have, tell us what a boil water advisory means, not just what you're supposed to do, but how that comes about.
Well, there's various do not consume, there's boil water advisory, there's do not use. Predominantly, there are boil water advisories, which means there's some sort of contaminant or bug in your water that could hurt you or make you sick. And to get rid of it, you got to boil your water for a roiling boil for over a minute before you can use it. And in some cases, it's worse than that, where they can't use the water at all. And some of it is they can use it to bathe, but they can't drink it, no matter what you do to it. And that would be contaminants.
Okay, so those contaminants, then, we've heard stories that some of the major newspapers have done in the north of Ontario. Even sometimes then, if you boil the water, if you wash the baby off with the water after, they can still get a rash. Is that true?
Yeah, I guess so. Like some people also have different sensitivities to different things. But for the most part, a lot of them, the drinking water guidelines are based on ingesting it. And then there are some things that should be do not use, like do not have it on your skin at all. So yes, you're correct.
Okay, a lot of people would be surprised to know that not too long before we built Casino Rama, there were many boil advisory warnings here, right on the Rama Reserve. You'd remember that as a kid growing up here, right?
Yep, I remember we still had a well, and we didn't want to connect to the water system. when it first came up to Longford.
Yeah,
Well,
we were a little bit.
My parents.
Yeah, yeah, and we were a little bit paranoid about hooking up something that the government says is perfectly good too, as well. Okay, tell us about some of the work you've done in Indian country and some of the major challenges that you had to face.
We've worked on quite a few water projects and some wastewater projects as well. We've also done some subdivisions and roads and landfill closures and things like that. We've kind of run the gamut of infrastructure projects. I would say one of the major hurdles are funding. So for the most part, a lot of like a municipality would have a tax base and they would put their funds together and they would make a plan of what they're going to do with those funds year over year. So if they needed to build new roads, they would have money to build those roads. But First Nations don't have a tax base, so they don't have that money. So they have to either have economic development that's making money for them, or go to the government and ask them for money to do these projects. And in Ontario alone, there's over 100 First Nations who are all asking for money. Across the country, I think there's over 600 First Nations across the country all asking for money. So it's a big ask, and the AFN, or the Assembly of First Nations, who kind of represents all of Indian country nationally, they always put out bulletins saying, you know, the infrastructure dollars being allocated to First Nations isn't cutting it, especially for housing, especially for roads. The primary focus of ISK seems to be water systems right now, which for good reason, people need to have clean drinking water, but there still seems to be a pretty paternalistic view on how some of those projects are run. As an example, we were recently working on a project, and ISK was only funding a portion of it, but they still, you know, had a say in how big the actual water plant was and some of the materials being used and why are you doing this and why are you doing that. If you want our, you know, 20% of the project that we're funding, you got to listen to our concerns. And some of them are valid, don't get me wrong, but some of them are cost saving measures that may not make sense when you have to actually operate this thing. Like, for example, they have a valve in the middle of a floor, like a big valve that comes up with a big wheel on it that you got to turn to open up pipes or close pipes. And it's right in the middle of the floor. You have to walk around it to go around it to go out a door. And that's partly because ISK said, no, the building's too big. It costs too much money. You got to make it smaller.
Okay, so I've read as well, probably was Toronto Star, Globe and Mail, that that federal department also has a big say in who the community uses to do the work.
They do and they don't. So it's interesting because ISK is supposed to be a funding authority only, which means, and provide technical advice and guidance. They're not supposed to run projects. If you ever listen to the minister talk, he says, oh, it's a First Nations project. We just help them with funding and provide guidance. The First Nation is responsible for all those things. But then we've had experience where what the minister says and what the prime minister are saying isn't trickling down to like the actual staff, who are much more involved, having much more comments and saying, you got to do this or you're not going to get funding. And it will come down to, sometimes they're talking about contractors for the most part, where they're saying you have to pick the lowest cost contractor. And sometimes, depending on how a job is put out for, we call it being put out for tender for contractors to bid on, a contractor would come in and say, oh yeah, I can do that for $1 million, and then do a really poor job because everyone else said, oh no, this is a $3 million job. But the federal government's saying, oh, they're the low contractor, so you got to go with them, unless there's a really good reason why you can't. So one of the things that has come out of all those is ISK, the minister announced that they're going to kind of go on, we've been jokingly referring to it as a witch hunt, going after contractors and consultants who have been acting in bad faith. But it's interesting, if you read between the lines, they never once mention their own part in it.
Right. Okay. I see. The other thing, I suppose, if you're talking about remote, especially fly-in communities, if they decide they need a water plant and they get the right people in to build it, they build it. The next problem they're going to have is who's going to staff it.
Yeah, and that's been a big issue all across the country because at best, ISK will fund 80% of your operations and maintenance at best. But that's according to, they have a formula that we call it a magic wand. They wave a magic wand and say, you get this much money. It's not necessarily based on anything because it was developed, I think, last updated 20, 30 years ago, this model, and it's barely kept up with inflation, but it's still based on really outdated policies, I guess. So you're getting 80% of an outdated number that doesn't necessarily match what it actually costs in real time to operate these things.
And especially as well, when you're building it, if you're in a fly-in community, you have to get the parts up there somehow. They can't send them in a truck. There's no road, right?
Exactly. Which causes another huge headache because you have delivery lead times that you got to try to, account for and then get things all shipped up when you can get them shipped up and have things on standby. And if you don't have it on standby, then what do you do until you can get something that breaks? Because a lot of municipalities, they have this problem where we call it asset management, where you have proactive maintenance and you put money aside. So, we got a pump that it's 5 years old. So in 2 years, we're going to have to, do whatever to it, or we're going to have to replace it. So we have this money set aside. But even municipalities have trouble with that. And ISK is now, they're kind of trying to put money out for First Nations to develop asset management plans, but they're more or less leaving up to First Nations to kind of do it. And some, as you know, some First Nations they're, I guess, more willing to do that than others, I guess, is the best way to put it. Or they don't even have the resources to do it. Because they're one of 600 bands asking for money to do this.
Okay. I've run into people who've said, wasn't it nice when Rama got this big water system when they built the casino to have the government throw all that money at you? But that isn't exactly the case. Am I correct?
Yeah. And I'm not 100% sure about who funded Rama's water system, but I think, the federal government paid for maybe a small portion of it. The rest of it is probably paid for by Rama and whatever partnership they had with the casino, or OLG for that matter. But I don't even think OLG probably would have put money into it.
Right. And then we still have to keep it up too. And now that it's hooked up to all our houses, we really have to keep it up daily. And I know in this community, they sent people away to wastewater treatment school because we didn't have anybody who could run it.
Yeah.
So that's we're lucky we were able to do that. We're on a good road and we could send the people off to learn how to do that. That can't happen in the north or even an hour outside Toronto.
And you bring up a really good point, because in a lot of communities, to get like an operator certified to the level of their plant, it can take a few years. Like if plants are certified by class like 1, 2, 3, 4, based on how complicated they are and how many people they serve. So if you're a class 3 plant, then it could take 3 years, 4 years. And that's if things go perfectly to get your certification to run that plant. So, and in a lot of cases, because the federal government wasn't providing enough O&M dollars, if you get that certification, you're likely not being paid what people are being paid in municipalities, so they leave.
The other thing, I wanted to take you back to when you worked for Indian Affairs or ISK. And if you're looking around the office, whether you're in BC or the East Coast, were you working with First Nations engineers?
Predominantly, no. In the Atlantic region, one of my colleagues, he was a First Nations engineer. So that was two of us out of, well, how many of us were there? 6 or 7, I guess. But in the BC region, there was a lot more engineers, and I think I was the only one at the time I was there.
All right. So I would expect you're a pretty hot commodity as far as the federal government's concerned, right?
Oh, well, I guess if you say so.
Well, you worked on both coasts for the same branch of the government. They must have liked you, plain and simple.
I like to think so.
Okay. All right. So if you didn't have a lot of First Nations engineers in the office and you're going out to Indian country to do the work and deal with chief and councils and all kinds of other people along the way, there must have been sometimes, maybe many times, when the people around that chief and council table were a little mistrustful of who was coming in to work with them. Am I right?
Yeah, I remember actually my interview when I was applying to ISK. All of the people on the interview panel, they arrayed themselves across the table from me, and they took on the role of angry chief and council, and
for real?
banging their fists on the table, saying, "What do you know, being in Vancouver in your ivory tower, about our issues here in our community? Who are you to tell us what to do?" To gauge how I would react to that, which I've had experience dealing with many chiefs and councils up to that point, so I was able to kind of calmly say, well, this is just my opinion. I'm here to support you and whatever you think needs to be done. But that's part of my background of, how I grew up with chiefs and councils and like day-to-day business of a First Nation and working in lots of other different First Nations as a consultant. Whereas a lot of my colleagues, I guess, my former colleagues, they wouldn't have that background necessarily, or in some cases they never even set foot on a reserve. Especially like in Ontario, they're based out of Toronto, a lot of them. So to get to a First Nation from Toronto, we're one of the closest ones, and we're still hour and a half, 2 hours away.
Wow. So actually, in the interview, did they say, "I'm the chief, these are my council, you're coming for the interview"?
Yep. And they kind of prepared me before, saying like, it's going to be a thing. Here's some issues you got to go through and rank, and we'll be chief and council, and you got to present it to us. I didn't know they were going to do that. I thought it was kind of funny at the time.
That's pretty bizarre when you think about all the rules there are about hiring people. Make sure all the applicants have the same experience, same questions, same opportunity to answer the questions, all those things. That's funny. It could end up in a book somewhere.
Yeah.
So if you had been the boss of those engineering people, either on the East Coast or the West Coast, and you're the Aboriginal engineer in the room and in the department, how would you have set that up to more accurately reflect us as Native people?
Well, one of the things, even when I was there, I told my colleagues, listen, we're Indigenous services now. We're here to provide a service to Indigenous people. We're not Indian Affairs getting into the Indians' affairs. That's kind of how I tried to lay it out. So, whose money are you saving? It's not coming out of your wallet. And if it's going to make like the project way better or work better for the First Nation, what does it matter if we spend an extra, in the terms of a project, 1% of the budget to save money later, kind of thing. So that's how I kind of approached it. But in terms of setting up, it's a challenge because there's only so many Indigenous engineers out there, and you may not want to go work for the federal government because it is kind of the other side of the tracks to go work for them. And I kind of went with rose-colored glasses, hoping to kind of make some changes and do some things. And I like to think that I made a difference in the communities I worked in, but you can only do so much as one person, I guess.
So when you said that thing very directly to your colleagues, how was that received? Some cases received better than others.
I guess. It was, for the most part, they were receptive to it, but it's still trying to change the way things have been done for the past, hundreds of years. So
yeah. More than 150 now officially.
Yeah.
Okay, so it sounds to me like when you work for that federal department, that there isn't any kind of First Nations awareness training or sensitivity training, as they've called it before. Tell us about that.
There is. It's just, you can only, training only does so much, right? If you're not out there actually experiencing it, as you must know, or as anyone would know, you could train for it, but it's a lot different than going out and experiencing it, especially because every First Nations experience is vastly different from the one next to it. So it's hard to, I'll sympathize with the federal government that it's hard to, take 600 different First Nations who are all very unique nations and put them together and say, this is how you have to be respectful to this, this giant different landmass. Not everyone could be Otto von Bismarck and unify Germany.
Okay. Now I want you to look to the future, Matt. You went off to school. You probably were the only one in the university at that time taking engineering. Do you know if that's right?
In my class, there was one other guy who was from north of Sioux Lookout.
Okay. Have you ever heard from him again? Do you know where he's working?
I haven't, and no, I don't.
It must be a pretty small world with Aboriginal engineers. So when you look ahead to the future, Matt, and how Indian Affairs has, what their role is, how they've done things over the last while, what do you see in the future, 5-10 years from now?
Well, they talk a lot about UNDRIP, which is the UN Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People, I think it is. And
UNDRIP?
Yeah.
that's funny. Okay.
Yeah. And how they're going to implement that. But current practices don't reflect it, which is, saying we have an inherent right in how things are developed in our territories and how projects go. But that's not what's happening. And I remember when I first started work for the federal government, that's when the Liberals first got elected, and Carolyn Bennett was the new minister of ISK, and she came, visited all the regions, and she did a speech, and she said, we're working ourselves out of a job. That's our goal. And I truly do hope that is their goal, that they're going to start downloading responsibility back down to the First Nations themselves to say, yeah, manage your projects how you want to manage them, get it done and do it how you want it done.
We've spent half an hour together talking about your life and your work. And I thank you so much, Matthew Douglas, Indigenous engineer, for sharing your insights on what it's been like out there. Thank you so much. Chimigwech.
Thank you for having me.